lot of organizations are now saying that they have a zero tolerance policy to racism. But then what was their tolerance policy before? Sounds like an empty shell policy. I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because we're talking about 3 clues to reveal if you have an empty shell policy towards racism. An empty what? An empty shell policy. I first came across this term 10 years ago in a research paper by Professor Kim Hock and Professor Mike New, in which they were evaluating the empty shell hypothesis. They used that term to describe equal opportunity policies that weren't genuine. Policies that were in place but weren't in practice. Policies that didn't have the outcomes that they claimed. Why am I talking about this now? Like I said, a lot of organizations are now saying that they have a zero tolerance policy towards racism. But I'm concerned that it could be another empty shell policy. How can you tell? Well, here are 3 clues. First is the idea of business as usual. Discrimination in the workplace is already illegal. Take the UK for an example. The Equality Act 2010 legally protects people from discrimination based on what's known as the protected characteristics. You're protected from discrimination based on your race, your religion, sexual orientation. There's 9 protected characteristics. You've probably got something similar where you live and where you work. The point I'm making is that a public announcement that you're basically following the law shouldn't be celebrated. It shouldn't be a big deal. It should be business as usual. Not tolerating discrimination should not be a big deal. Unless, of course, business as usual means that you were tolerating discrimination. Then that makes sense. But what does that say about the organization? Is the bar so low that saying that you don't break the law attracts praise? I'm sure that as part of your personal life, you can think of a lot of laws that you don't break every day. You're probably not going to announce to anyone that you don't steal other people's belongings because we hope that it all goes without saying. I know I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. The announcements draw attention to the low standards of conduct that organizations had, or worse, still have. If this sounds like where you work, then maybe you've got an empty shell policy. The second clue that you should consider is that empty shell policies lend themselves to ambiguity. Like I said, they are policies in place, but not in practice. They don't necessarily have the meaning, thought, or substance that you might expect. This is why they're empty. Saying that racism is wrong or that it shouldn't be tolerated is a rhetorical statement with little meaning to stakeholders until you explain your relationship to racism, until you provide some content to show how it's going to be addressed. If your organization is unable to do that, then maybe you've got an empty shell policy. The third and final clue I want you to consider is motivation. What's the reason for introducing the policy in the first place? If an organization is making claims to present their values in a positive light, understanding their motivation for doing so becomes completely reasonable. Suppose an organization, not your organization of course, but an organization that you know, says that it stands with the black community. Why do you think they're doing that? What's motivated them to express this opinion? What's motivated them to provide financial support to a community that maybe they've paid little or no attention to in the past? Is it an inherent part of their organizational values? Is it consistent with their organizational culture? Is it part of their vision of the future of their organization? If so, how does this show up within their organization? How do they stand with the black community within their organization? If we're talking about the black community, what is the experience of black employees within their organization? Is this part of a long-term plan, or is it a reaction, a PR exercise perhaps, an attempt to manage their perception in the marketplace? If this last bit sounds like where you work, then maybe you've got an empty shell policy. You would be surprised how easy it is to read this in real life. It's all around us. Make a note of some of the companies that you know who have made big statements. In about 6 months, we'll start to see who has a policy in place and who has a policy in practice. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? 1. Empty shell policies refer to policies in place but not in practice. 2. Empty shell policies may be business as usual where you work. And 3. If you have an empty shell policy when it comes to inclusion, where else do you have them? So what do you think? Have you got any empty shell policies at work? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, then leave us a review on iTunes. It helps other people like you to find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.